And this is week 2, video 6, covering some more recent perspectives on gender and sex. So as we saw in the last set of videos, many early anthropologists looking at sex and gender noticed that oppression against women seemed to be pretty universal in the world. Well, anthropologists such as Margaret Mead, who investigated this further, found that there were societies where women were not oppressed, where in fact women had certain forms of power that men didn't. But it did seem to be that women faced oppression generally in the world. But as anthropologists continued to investigate this, they realized that more nuanced understandings, more nuanced questions, more nuanced investigations, and more nuanced analyses were required in order to make sense of what seemed to be the prevalence of female oppression in the world. So I want to talk about some of these perspectives and begin with a couple of questions about agency. So agency is a big term in anthropology and lots of other fields right now, and it has to do with sort of individual action within societal and cultural constraints. So anthropologists for a long time tended to really focus on the structure of a society, the structure of culture, and how it remained kind of rigid and in place. And as I've told you, a more recent view of culture focuses on how culture is more flexible and it changes a little bit. And as anthropologists have developed that notion of culture with more of its emphasis, with more of an emphasis on its negotiability, they've looked at the agency of individuals within culture to bring change to culture. So agency simply has to do with the ability of an individual to make choices and act within the constraints that are placed on that individual by society and culture. So, what kind of freedom of choice do I have as an individual living right now, given that every possible choice is not really open to me because I exist within a social, cultural, historical structure, and so forth and so on. So these feminist anthropologists and others started asking the question, well, where do the individual and individual choice come into the culture in terms of sex and gender? And how does culture change even as it's reproduced? So these questions, you can see them coming from this period of like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and thereafter. First of all, as there's more of an emphasis on the individual choice of women, and as society is changing very rapidly in terms of women and women's status, women's rights, so it provoked these questions. And so one of the ways that anthropologists chose to answer these questions about agency, and this is just one of the ways, just to kind of demonstrate the way agency is addressed, was through Judith Butler's notion of performativity. Judith Butler is not an anthropologist, but a philosopher, but a lot of Butler's works are used by anthropologists in this area. So this notion of performativity is that gender is enacted through really a performance of speech acts and utterances that give the impression of a coherent gender identity. Okay, so if we were in the classroom and I was up in front lecturing to you now, you would notice that I'm a woman. But the reason you would notice that is because I have made choices to perform as a woman. So I speak, I modulate my voice in a certain way. I'm perfectly capable of lecturing to you in a voice like this, but I choose not to because in my society, women speak with a higher voice. You would notice that I'm wearing makeup. On certain days, you might notice that I bothered to fix my hair, although that's always questionable. I'd be wearing clothes that you would identify as the clothing that women typically wear, not men in our society. And just the way I move my body, the way I gesture, so many things about my performance at the head of the classroom would be a female performance. And then I might ask you to look around the classroom and notice the differences between how men are sitting and how women are sitting. When men raise their hand to ask a question or to answer a question, how they answer the question differently from the way women answer it. How they're wearing different clothing, different colors of clothing, how their hair is cut differently, and lots of other things. And then I might ask you to go out in your social world on the campus of Gettysburg College and notice some things. Notice when men and women are performing maleness and femaleness. So when I first moved to Gettysburg, I lived on West Water Street. Big mistake because I never got a good night's sleep, especially not on a Thursday or Friday or Saturday night because of all the people coming back from the parties to campus. And I heard a lot of gender performances as I lay there in my bed wishing that I could sleep. I would hear some people going like, "Dude, Stalin, what, dude?" And guess what? Those were always men. And then I would hear other voices going, "Oh my God, this is so crazy. I can't believe we're out here doing this. Oh my God." And guess what? Those were always women. And I started to notice this performance, this performativity. So especially in sort of situations where people are partying, maybe kind of looking for romantic partners or hookups or something like that, the dress, the gestures, the voice, the performance will be even more starkly male or female. Okay, so think about all of this. Think about some of the performances that you see and maybe some of the performances that you do in order to convince other people that you are male or female. And that's the notion of performativity. So gender is not something real about sex and sexual differences as much as it's about performances. Now, why is this about agency? Because, according to Judith Butler, a performance can change a great deal. Okay, so if you've ever been involved in the theater and you've been performing on stage, or maybe you're a musician performing on stage, you'll know that with a performance, there's a script or there's a musical score, but there's also potential for a lot of things to happen that aren't in that script or on that musical score. Someone can make a mistake. Someone can forget a line and then have to improvise a line. Someone from the audience, their cell phone can ring, or they can make a loud noise and throw the performance off, distract the performers. So it's kind of a good metaphor for culture and gender performance. So culture gives us a script. You're biologically male, here's your script. You're biologically female, here's your script. And we perform that script, but at the same time, there's room for the individual to perform it a little bit differently. And then as individuals perform the script differently, culture can change, okay? So that's how we're able to see vast change very quickly when it comes to gender roles. Okay, some other more recent perspectives about this notion of the kind of rigidity of sex and gender and the idea of women being being oppressed by the sex gender system. I want to cover three. And again, these are some of many perspectives, and you may be familiar with some of them. So first of all, some anthropologists really chose to focus on power and where power resides, not so much in gender roles and expectations, but how those are related to power. So, for example, anthropologists would talk about the public-private divide. Men tend to exist more in the public. They're out, working. They're running political systems. They're making laws. And women might tend to be more, in many societies, more in the home, caring for the children, feeding the family, that sort of thing. And so, some feminist anthropologists said it's not so much that we prefer men to women or we oppress women in favor of men. It's more that we have a cultural preference for the public. Whether men or women are in the public, we prefer the public roles. So one strategy of feminists has been to get more women in public roles. Let's get more women in political office. Let's have more women being CEOs of corporations. And many of the anthropologists who worked in this area of power said, actually, we won't fully change things until we do quite the opposite, where we make it so that the private role, whoever's in that role, is as good as the public role. So then when we can have men or women saying, oh, I want to stay home and raise the children, that will be just as good as men or women saying, oh, I want to be a corporate CEO. Okay, so it's more about the power inherent in the public sphere and lacking in the private sphere is why it looks like women tend to be oppressed in the world. But it's really not about women. Does that make sense? A second perspective is about inequality and intersectionality of identities. So feminist anthropologists and others working in this area said it's ridiculous to say that women are oppressed by men because rich women are certainly not oppressed by poor men. And for example, in the United States, generally in history, white women have not been oppressed by black men. So it's not really men and women per se. It's about where men and women fit within other social structures of race, ethnicity, class, religion, sexuality. And we're much more sophisticated about this way of thinking than we were even 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And we're really sort of used to this idea that it's really an intersectionality of identities rather than just these simple binaries, like men have it better than women, and this group has it better than that group. Okay, and then the third the third more recent perspective is that instead of saying that a sex-gender system oppresses women, maybe we could say that a rigid sex-gender system oppresses everyone. So, for example, I heard someone say recently that, women really bear the brunt of the pain and suffering during times of conflict because they can face violence directly. Often women are raped in times of conflict. They lose their husbands, their sons, their daughters. They face all this kind of suffering and death. And that's true. I teach a class called The Anthropology of Violence and Conflict, and we look at this example again and again in the world. But guess what? Men in times of conflict, because they're men, also are overwhelmingly victims of, sort of directly dying in combat. They're much more likely to be imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And they also face other kinds of suffering, such as the death of loved ones, and so forth and so on. So in this example, we see it's not that women suffer more from conflict because they're women. Rather, it's that men and women both face different kinds of violence and suffering because of their gender, because men are more likely to be recruited as the fighters, and because women are more likely to be in the home, trying to deal with the loss of these loved ones. Okay, so it's this idea that it's sort of ridiculous to single out women as being oppressed. Instead, if we look at the way the system oppresses everyone, that might be a more productive approach. Obviously, that can be controversial for some because then it takes the emphasis off the special ways that women might suffer because they're, for example, a second-class citizen within a particular society, or because maybe they didn't have as many choices as men did to protect themselves from violence or to avoid violence or something like that. So that has its controversies, but it is a very important perspective